Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction House taking a look at some of the guns they're going to be selling in their upcoming June of 2017 regional auction. And today, we're kind of looking at these two guns, but we're actually discussing a general subject instead, and that is the German double date stamp guns that you will occasionally find. This double date stamp is the original date of manufacture of a World War I German firearm, and then the date 1920. And so what you'll from time to time find are guns that have two dates on them, the original and then the second 1920 date stamped above. And what we have here are two very nice examples of exactly this. We have a Luger made in 1920 stamped with a second 1920, and we have a Carbiner 98 here made in 1918 and then stamped 1920. So what's the deal? Why do these things have double date stamps? Well, the answer is that the second stamp is actually not a date at all. It's a property mark. And to explain why, we have to go back a little bit to the end of World War I. On November 11th, 1918, when the Great War ended, the German military had in its possession something like 5 to 5.5 million Mauser rifles and carbines. While under the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, eventually ratified in 1920, the German military was allowed 100,000 men, and between the German army, the Reichswehr, and a number of various internal security forces, guys like customs enforcement, border guards, forestry guards, railway police, all these sorts of auxiliary type of police units. Between those and the army, they were allowed about 200,000 rifles and carbines out of 5.5 million that they had on hand. So at the insistence of the Inter-Allied Military Control Commission, which was the group set up to ensure that the Germans behaved by the terms of the Versailles Treaty, the Germans were really pushed to institute a massive program of weapons confiscation and destruction. Of these rifles that the army possessed, a great number of them came back to Germany kind of just in the hands of soldiers who had them. A lot of these things just kind of dispersed into the populace. And Germany of just after the end of the war was an extremely chaotic place politically. There was a lot of socialist movement, communist movement going on, nationalist movements. It was a time of substantial upheaval. Of course, the government had basically been obliterated, or its standing had been destroyed. And so there was a lot of jockeying for power. And what made this gun confiscation and destruction program more feasible was that at this point, confiscating guns from a lot of the people at large was in the interest of the Allies, and it was also in the interest of the formal German government. In order to remain more securely in power, one of the very important things they could do was to disarm the dissident political groups that were threatening them. So between these two things, there was a major civilian disarmament law passed in 1920, and there was actually a bounty put out on guns. For the first, I think it was about the first 6 months, you'd get 100 marks per gun turned in, and then for a couple months after that, you would get 50 marks for turning in a gun. And at the end of this amnesty period, you wouldn't get anything, but you'd get arrested if you were caught with one. And this resulted in the civilian population turning in about 900,000 military arms. And then the army and the various security forces collected up another 4 million or so. They destroyed about 5 million guns in Germany between like 1919 and the end of 1921. So this program was largely effective. On the other hand, it was also very widely subverted and ignored. In Bavaria in particular, there were citizen militia units that were kind of under the table supported by the Bavarian government, and they stockpiled a lot of guns. In fact, today, looking back as a collector, you'll find guns that were, say, World War I Gewehr 98s, manufactured in the teens during the war, that then have upgrades to them, like these flat tangent sights that were applied in the 1930s, but they don't have this 1920 property stamp. And these are guns that were illegally possessed, that were hidden away during the Weimar period. And when the Nazis began to rearm Germany, a lot of these guns kind of came out of the woodwork and were folded into the military arsenals. So anyway, I have gone a little bit past my point, which is at the same time that the government was confiscating civilian arms, the military also was they basically had this huge pool of guns to choose from, everything that had existed at the end of the war, and they had very strict limits on what they were allowed to possess by the Allies. And so they went through and got to choose, okay, we get 100,000 rifles for the Army, which 100,000 do we want? A lot of them, they picked carbines. One of the things the German military establishment learned in World War I was that this long rifle concept was obsolete, and carbines were the way of the future. In fact, the Karabiner 98K that Germany would adopt in the 30s and use through World War II is exactly the same length as the World War I Karabiner 98. So a lot of the guns that they chose to keep were carbines. When it came to handguns, they chose mostly Lugers to keep because, of course, they could have 32s. They could, and in fact, 32s weren't restricted by Versailles. But when it came to choosing between, for example, broom-handle Mausers, C96 Mausers, and Lugers, well, the Luger was a much better pistol. It was more modern, it was more effective, and it was definitely the choice if you had a choice between the two. So in order to note that, or to certify that a particular gun was a military property gun, they stamped a 1920 on it. Not that they stamped it in 1920, but they used 1920 because of the significance of that date as it related to Versailles and the German gun control laws. That became a property stamp. If it were stamped with that second 1920, it meant it was a government-owned gun. If it were found in civilian hands, that meant someone had stolen it. It gave the Allies, in theory, something that they could tabulate and keep records on, although I don't know how much of that actually existed. A lot of the reason that the rearmament was feasible in the early 30s was that the Allied attention to this really waned over the years. The Allies were really focused and insistent on enforcing Versailles early on, and the more time went by, the less rigorous they got, and the more lax their enforcement, which allowed guns to come back out of the woodwork and the German military to start to be rebuilt. At any rate, you will find that the most common two guns to find these 1920 property stamps on are these two, Lugers and Kar98 carbines. However, you'll also find them on a few other guns, MP-18 submachine guns, although of course there isn't one in this particular auction, but you'll often find them there. Occasionally, C96 Mausers, those are out there with some 1920 date stamps. In theory, you could also find them on Gewehr 98 long guns, although those are much less common to find than the carbines. Because again, this was, why would you pick a Gewehr 98 long rifle to keep when you had the option of a Karabiner 98? There were plenty of these. You could have armed the entire Versailles Reichswehr with carbines, and that's kind of what they did. So to me, this makes for a really cool bit of history. You have a rifle, or a pistol in this case, that was manufactured and used during the war, or at least we know that this 1918 one was, would have been used during the war, and then the Weimar government chose to keep it, and so what they would often do is they'd refurbish these guns. So this one is in fantastic shape because after its wartime use, the Versailles government, or the Weimar government, refurbished it, brought it back up to very nice condition. And then some of these you'll find with, for example, duffel cuts, indicating that they were brought home by US servicemen after World War II. You'll find some of these being issued out to groups like the Deutsches Reichspost, a carbine for a postal inspector who needed to protect trains from, say, the near anarchy of Germany in the early 20s. And that gives these guns that much more historical legacy that we can prove, which is really cool. Now, one of the other interesting elements is this isn't restricted to World War I guns because, to a limited extent, Germany was still manufacturing firearms through 1920 or 1921. They were allowed to make some guns. They were allowed to refurbish guns that existed, that sort of thing. This Luger is actually a 1920 production DWM Luger with that second 1920 property stamp also put on it. So that's a pretty rare combination right there. You'll even occasionally find 1921 manufactured guns with the 1920 property stamp. Again, because that 1920 isn't there to indicate a date, it's there to indicate government ownership. So anyway, I thought it would be cool to just touch on this one little interesting, I think, aspect of German firearms marking and collectability. There are these two guns in particular, and I know there's at least one other double-stamped Luger in this auction, There are probably a number of other guns. I didn't go out of my way to try and find every single one of them that's in this auction, but if you're interested in one of these two, I have links to their catalog pages in the description below, and if you search through the catalog, I suspect you can find some others as well. Thanks very much for watching.